Our focus lesson this morning comes to us from the book of Job, portions of the 23rd chapter, verses 1 through 9 and 16 and 17. You can find that in your Pew Bible on page 471 if you wish to follow along. From last week and this week we're reading from the book of Job, and the whole theme of it is rebuffing the idea that God punishes and rewards depending upon how good we have been or how bad we have been. Or at least, perhaps someone even in our family. As we heard last week, the beginning of Job is set in a heavenly court in which Satan appears. God asks about Job, and Satan questions God's appreciation of Job's character. Satan then removes all of Job's wealth and well-being, but Job continues faithful and insistent upon his innocence, in spite of the arguments that he is presented by his friends and the badgering of his wife. So let us listen this morning as Job responds from the 23rd chapter. Then Job answered, "Today also my complaint is bitter. His hand is heavy in spite of my groaning. Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come even to his seat. I would lay my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would learn what he would answer me and understand what he would say to me. Would he contend with me in the greatness of his power? No, he would give heed to me. There an upright man could reason with him, and I should be acquitted forever by my judge. Behold, I go forward, but he is not there, and backward, but I cannot perceive him. On the left hand I seek him, but I cannot behold him, and I turn to the right hand, but I cannot see him. God has made my heart faint. The Almighty has terrified me, for I am hemmed in by darkness, and thick darkness covers my face." The word of the Lord through the prophet Job. We give praise and thanks. Amen. All right, let me first dispel any thoughts that this is me on the cover. I thought it was just a passing thought when Jennifer said, well, someone came in the office and said they wanted to know if that was you. But then when I went into choir this morning, everybody seemed to wonder if that was me and had plans on getting other people from the congregation on the cover of the bulletin in the weeks to come. But since this isn't me, you can expel that idea. That's not going to happen. But that being said, let me begin by sharing a story of a gentleman that went shopping at one of our local grocery stores. And while he was shopping, he observed a woman with what looked like to be about a 3-year-old little girl in the cart. And as they were going through the store, he encountered her several times. The first time that he encountered her, it was apparently about halfway through the shopping trip for the mother and the little girl, because the little girl was getting a little antsy being in the shopping cart. And the mother was saying, "Now, Ellen, don't worry. We're about halfway through, so this will be okay. We'll get through this and get home." So the gentleman went on shopping down a couple more aisles, and then he went down the candy aisle, and the mother and the little girl were there in the middle of the candy aisle, and the little girl was just screaming about wanting candy. And The mother looks and says, Ellen, just take a deep breath. Just calm down. It'll be all right. We're almost through and we'll get home. So they got to the checkout, and the gentleman got to the checkout, and the mother and the little girl were ahead of him. And of course, there at the checkout, there's more candy and gum. And this time the little girl was just throwing an awful temper tantrum because she had discovered that there was not going to be any gum. And the mother just very calmly standing there saying, Ellen, it's all right. We're almost through. In a few minutes, we'll be in the car, we'll go home, and be able to take a nap. Well, this man was so impressed after he purchased his items, he followed out to the parking lot and saw the woman there unloading her groceries into her car, and he walked up to her and he says, Ma'am, I just want to tell you how great I think you are with your daughter Ellen. She said, Ellen? My name's Ellen. My daughter's Tammy. Ellen was having a terrible day. I mean, just admit it. Just admit it. And we've had days like that. I mean, we can certainly identify with Job, maybe not to the degree that Job was experiencing a terrible time. I took the title from, that wonderful book of who was it that was having a terrible, awful, horrible day? Alexander, right. But that's all I'm going to talk about, Alexander. Actually, that's Alexander on the cover of the bulletin. But Job has lost his farm, his animals, his house, his children. And we heard from the beginning of last week in the scripture where his wife even comes to him and says, Job, just give it up. You've done something awful, I'm sure, and so therefore just give it up and go on. Why, you might as well die. And he has 3 friends that approach him as well. And their response is, Job, what have you done? Search your heart, search your soul, because there's got to be something that you have done that is so terrible, that is so awful, that God is punishing you for. I mean, that was the theology of that day that even carried into Jesus' times. Because when Jesus approached Bartimaeus, the blind man, one of the questions that was asked was, what sin did he do to deserve blindness, or his parents? And Jesus' response was, this man didn't do anything. But that was the theology of the day. If something bad happened, God was punishing you. If something good happened, God was rewarding you. Wouldn't it be lovely if it was as easy as that? Really? But it isn't. I mean, we've all had bad days. Some of us have had terrible days. And yet we continue in faith to move forward. But it isn't easy if you've dealt with a loss, a death in your family. Then to be able to pick up and move on. You can't carry on as if today was the same as yesterday, because things have significantly changed, have significantly altered in your life. And it has to be acknowledged. I mean, that is part of the healing process that we as people go through. And so Job's answer to the healing process is he wanted to confront God. He wanted to be able to stand in front of God and, as a good lawyer would do, present his case of why he didn't deserve the punishments that he was receiving. And he was absolutely certain that God, being God, would be fair and would listen to him and would then see that Job was right, and God would make everything perfect for Job again. But I again say, life just doesn't work that way. As a pastor, I have my challenges. And I guess the lowest point in my ministry was something like 15 years ago. And personally, I was going through a challenge. I was divorcing my wife. And it was a struggle for me in that time because I approached our marriage as the fact that I'm a pastor. I should not be divorced. I should be able to exemplify for my congregation the fact that any challenges that comes up in my relationships with my family should be able to be dealt with in a healthy way. And therefore, divorce was not an option. Until I came to the conclusion that we, my wife and I, for years had worked at approaching the healthy way. We were being counseled for years. We were communicating, at least trying to communicate with each other, and it just wasn't working. And it came to the point of realization on my part that it wasn't good for neither myself nor my wife, but it was disastrous for my children. You know, the old story of what we say is we got to stay together for the sake of the children. Well, in this case, we needed to separate for the case of our children because our children were becoming the victims of our marriage. But I, as a pastor, still felt I shouldn't be doing that. Now, at that same time, we had a young woman and a young man come to visit our church. And they started visiting regularly. It was right around Easter time. They were in their early 20s. And I got to know them a little bit from just the few times that they had been visiting, I think about 3 weeks or so. So, they were still relatively new. And I can recall one Friday night around 11:30 or 12, I got a telephone call. And it was Pastor Cindy, this was the girl, has been stabbed in an alleyway and has died. I immediately went to the family. The family were not church family members. But they told me Cindy's story, that she had been, as a teenager, gave birth to a wonderful little girl, but realized that the family needed to support Cindy in the raising of this child. And so for the first couple years, things went well, and then Cindy became attracted to a young man that was not the type of young man that the parents would have chosen for her. They moved in and lived together for a short while. And it turned out the young man was involved in drugs. He became a heroin addict. And at that point, Cindy realized that she needed to leave that relationship. So she took her child and moved back to her parents' house. Met this young man, Charles, and decided that what they needed was a good start in their relationship to go to church. And hence they started coming to our church. But on this particular Friday night, Charles, and Cindy went to this local bar that the young people went to. And her ex-boyfriend was there. And he took her by the arm and he said, "We need to talk." And he led her out into the alleyway from the bar. And a heated conversation began. And he pulled out a knife and he stabbed her 8 times. Charles followed and chased this young man down the alleyway and caught him. And then he was stabbed several times. The police finally caught this man many blocks away, covered in both Cindy's and Charles's blood. It was, as usual, a year and a half later that the case went before the judge. And the prosecuting attorney chose a jury. And, excuse me, not the prosecuting, but the defense chose a jury to try the case. And the defense did such a good job of defending the young man that he was convicted of third-degree murder. He convinced the jury that it wasn't a premeditated murder, but it was a murder of passion, that it was related to the drugs that the young man was on. And so when sentencing came up, he was sentenced to 20 to 60 years in jail. I guess now he's about 15 years into his sentencing. But when I went to see the family accepted me. I mean, they said, Pastor, we're glad that you're here, but the first thing we have to tell you is we are mad at God. Understandable. But you see, also this family had lost a son to a sickness. I forget what it was that the child had, but he died at 5 years old. And so now suddenly, all their focus had been on Cindy. And now their focus was on no children. What do you do? As a pastor, I listened. I wasn't going to convince them that it's not God's fault, but rather I just listened and loved them, met them in their pain and their grief, and just asked them, what can I do for you? We don't need to talk about God. I will pray for you, but what can we do to help you through this? The church rallied around this family. And while they still continued to be mad at God, they accepted the church family around them for the strength and the comfort that they needed to get through that experience. I went out into the yard one night and just screamed at the top of my lungs, why, God, have you abandoned me and your people? I went to visit one of our saints in the church. I have a different concept of saint, that it isn't a perfect person. Because you see, this saint that I went to visit, her husband had died. She was raising a family on her own, and we would have called her a motorcycle mama because she rode motorcycles and ran with a gang. But she was a faithful church member. And I told her, I go out running, out on the trail. And when I'm running, I hear steps behind me, and I look, and there's no one there. And I said, I know that when that happens, that Jesus is running with me. But I said, over the past few weeks, and all that I've been dealing with, I go out running, and I don't hear anything. I feel abandoned. And she said, good suggestion. Pastor, just pray. Just pray. And I left, and I started praying with all my heart, morning, noon, and night. Had the funeral for Cindy. Continued my running. And one day, I heard those footsteps echoing behind me again and knew that it wasn't Jesus or God that had abandoned me, but in my stress, in my struggle. I had really stopped hearing, stopped listening. That God is always here. Whether God's present to us through the community of faith or with one another, that God's angels are among us and we may be those angels to give comfort and strength and compassion. We'll still have horrible, terrible days, but we, as God's representatives, can be there for one another, to assure one another that God is still with us. Praise be to God.